The vast deserts of the American Southwest, those windswept reaches spanning New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, have long held secrets older than the borders drawn across them. And within these arid plains, the Navajo people carved their identity, their stories braided into the canyons like threads of ancient rope. A people shaped by war, survival, ceremony, and legends more potent than the weapons carried by modern soldiers. And although history remembers the Navajo for their wartime service during the Pacific campaigns of the Second World War, where code talkers used their intricate tongue to cloak American radio transmissions from Japanese cryptologists, that legacy is only one side of their story, because beneath the surface of heroism and loyalty lies an older mythology whispered around campfires. Legends of creatures not born of flesh alone, but of corruption, curses, and choices that twisted once-kind healers into monstrous abominations the Navajo call Yinaldlishii. The skinwalkers, being said to stride between the spirit world and the waking one, wearing the shapes of beasts yet carrying the cunning of humankind. And though outsiders dismiss these tales as superstition, the Navajo warn that such creatures, half human, half animal, begin as medicine men or women who abandon healing for darker desires, embracing murder and cannibalism until their humanity rots away, leaving them cursed with immortality, yet hunted by every living soul who knows what they have become. And while only death in their animal form is believed to end them, their ability to infiltrate minds, distort senses, and mimic voices leaves their victims confused, tormented, or driven to madness. Such are the stories carried by elders who remember the days when wandering too far from home after nightfall was a gamble with forces beyond explanation. And these stories persist even in modern times, as Navajo parents still warn their children that skinwalkers walk by daylight as easily as by night, waiting in silence on canyon ridges, running with such supernatural speed that no ordinary person could hope to outrun them, watching from distances where their glowing eyes pierce the desert heat haze. But while the Navajo carry these tales in their bones, they are no longer the only ones who speak of things that stalk the wilderness, because American service members, soldiers, Marines, airmen, who spend long nights training in remote forested bases and desert proving grounds have begun recounting encounters of their own, experiences that defy logic, where familiar wildlife bends into unfamiliar shapes, where animals move with too much purpose, too much awareness, or worse, speak in voices that should not come from their throats. And though many who tell such stories do so reluctantly, often while drinking to dull their nerves, a shared thread weaves through their accounts. Something old, something predatory, something that watches with intelligence not found in wolves, or rabbits, or deer. Something that steps just beyond the limits of natural law. And just as the Navajo once believed the wilderness was alive with things better left unmentioned, modern warriors now speak in hushed tones around smoke pits, looking over their shoulders at the tree leans surrounding bases, sharing the haunting suspicion that perhaps these creatures have never confined themselves to tribal lands at all, but wander wherever darkness gathers, wherever tragedy has left an imprint, wherever the border between the living world and the other one thins. For as these accounts grow in number and similarity, a chilling possibility emerges that the legends of the Southwest did not stay in the past, but instead followed the wind, crossing fences and state lines, drifting into the training grounds of America's armed forces, where young men and women hardened by combat simulation discover that no amount of military training prepares you for the moment an animal in the dark turns its head, not with instinctive fear, but with the calm, knowing stare of something that thinks, that chooses, that speaks. Night had settled thickly over the forested training grounds of Fort Lewis, the kind of military darkness that feels manufactured, so complete that even the stars seem unwilling to intrude. And as our platoon moved cautiously through the pine-choked ridges, the only sound were the soft crunch of boots through layers of wet needles and the suppressed breathing of men who'd learned the value of silence. We were young soldiers then, most barely old enough to legally drink, but we marched with the confidence of those who believed danger only came from human enemies, never suspecting that something older than warfare waited for us beneath those towering treetops, something that had been watching long before we arrived. The mission was routine, just a night navigation exercise designed to sharpen our sense of direction without the crutch of daylight, and we carried only blank fire magazines. Our rifles meant more for form than function, each of us half bored, half cold, until we reached the open glade that cut through the woods like a natural clearing, a hollow ring by trees so tall they resembled pillars of a forgotten temple. Sergeant McBride raised his fist, a silent halt command, and we froze, scanning the timberline for whatever had caught his eye, though none of us yet understood why his breathing suddenly grew sharp and shallow. Then we saw it. Not a person, not exactly an animal, but a shape that staggered between categories, hunched low to the ground yet tall enough, when it straightened to nearly match the height of a man. Its silhouette ragged and elongated, as if its limbs were borrowed from several creatures at once. And though we couldn't see its face clearly, we felt its stare, a strange tightening in the chest like a vice made of instinctual fear. Private Collins whispered that it was probably a deer, but his voice cracked with doubt, because no deer watches a formation of soldiers with such eerie stillness. No deer tilts its head as though evaluating each individual, marking them like entries in a mental ledger. The figure stepped forward with a slow, deliberate grace, and though the distance was too great for detail, I remember seeing something reflect from its face. A glimmer, a shimmer, like the pale echo of human eyes, and that tiny reflection struck more fear in me than any weapon ever had. McBride lifted his rifle, though he knew it carried no real rounds. But training is a kind of reflex, and fear amplifies instinct. Yet, before he could issue a warning, the creature vanished. Not by sprinting away, not by melting into the trees, but by collapsing into the darkness as though its body were poured into the night itself, dissolving without sound, leaving only ripples of disturbed silence behind. We stood frozen until the air shifted, carrying the thick, musky scent of something that did not belong in those woods, something feral and wrong. And when a twig snapped behind us, half the formation spun around, raising. Rifles they couldn't fire, eyes darting wildly. Nothing moved, and that somehow made it worse. Because if something could travel from a glade to behind us without noise, it meant it traveled with purpose, with intelligence, with intent. McBride ordered us to tighten formation, his voice trembling ever so slightly, and we marched, not with the crisp discipline of soldiers, but with the primal urgency of prey, trying not to appear afraid. Though fear radiated from every one of us, whispers spread through the ranks. Stories men had heard from Marines at Pendleton, from Rangers at Benning, tales of shadows that stalked training routes, sounds that mimicked voices in the dark, shapes that resembled wolves until they stood upright like men, creatures that avoided gunfire but approached unarmed soldiers with disturbing curiosity. And as we retreated toward the base perimeter, the woods seemed to close in around us, not physically, but atmospherically, as though the night had become sentient, and was inspecting each of us, weighing our fear like a flavor to savor. When the floodlights of the base finally appeared between the trees, never in our lives had artificial light seemed so sacred, and as we crossed the boundary fence, McBride finally exhaled the breath he had been holding. None of us spoke a word during debrief, and our instructors chalked our attention up to overactive imaginations. But the forest knew better, and so did we. For something ancient had watched us that night. Something that walked like an animal, yet observed like a man. Something that vanished when looked at too long, as if reality itself could not fully contain it. The following night, despite the unease that clung to us like cold fog, our platoon was ordered back into the woods for a second round of navigation drills, the commanders insisting that repetition cured fear and that what we'd seen was nothing more than nerves conjuring shadows. But the forest felt different now, as though it remembered us, and every tree seemed to lean inward like a towering witness, waiting for the next chapter of our panic. We carried real ammunition this time, live rounds, issued quietly, without ceremony, as if the officers didn't want to acknowledge that something had rattled them too. But even the reassuring weight of a loaded rifle couldn't push away the dread that collected in our stomachs, heavy and sour. The night was humid, the ground slick, and as we advanced in staggered formation, an unnatural stillness settled within the woods, so complete that even insects seemed to hold their breath. And somewhere deep inside that silence, an instinctual alarm bell rang, the kind that warns a man when he is no longer the hunter but something's chosen prey. When we reached the first waypoint, a weathered post half swallowed by roots, Sergeant McBride signaled a brief halt, and that was when we heard it. A voice calling out from the darkness ahead, the unmistakable tone of Private Collins, though he stood right beside me, his weapon raised, his face draining of color as he realized the voice belonged to him, yet didn't come from him. It called again, this time. Broken, distorted, as though stretched across distance and throat. A mockery of language that carried his pitch but none of his humanity, and the hair on my arm stood up in a rigid wave. The fake Collins voice called for help, then repeated a phrase he had said earlier that day during chow. Word for word, intonation perfect, only now sounding as if spoken from inside a cave, hollow and predatory. Men exchanged horrified glances, and the Real Collins backed away until his heels struck a fallen log, whispering that he had never spoken in that direction, that he hadn't wandered off, that whatever was calling us knew his voice too well. Then a second voice joined it, this time mimicking Sergeant McBride's gruff tone, a flawless imitation except for a faint warble beneath the words, like two vocal cords trying to speak at once. And when the imitation barked, "Move out," half the squad flinched, gripping their rifles as though metal alone could protect them. McBride signaled a tight circle, defensive stance, ordering us via hand gestures not to respond to the voices. And that was when leaves rustled just beyond our perimeter. Not enough to suggest a man walking, but too controlled and deliberate to be a deer or coyote, more like a shape sliding between the trees with unnatural ease. Private Hargrove whispered that he saw something crouched near a cluster of ferns, its eyes shining like dull coins reflecting our red lens flashlights. But when we swept the beam toward the spot, the eyes blinked out instantly, as though the creature had withdrawn behind a veil rather than simply moved. Then came the laughter, not a human laugh, nor an animal sound, but something caught in between, starting high and sharp before dropping into a gravelly rattle, mimicking amusement but feeling more like a threat. The laughter shifted positions around us, sometimes close enough that it rang just behind my ear, other times drifting from far off like a dying echo, as if the forest itself was, playing host to multiple unseen throats. Fear swelled inside the formation, men gripping rifles so tightly that fabric gloves creaked, and though protocol demanded we hold fire unless attacked, the line between attack and psychological torture blurred with every passing second as the voices began chanting. Not words we knew, but a corrupted string of syllables that rose and fell like a perverse ceremony. Suddenly the forest snapped back to life with movement, a shadow darting from trunk to trunk. With impossible speed, too fast to be human, yet too tall to be an animal, the outline blurred by darkness, yet unmistakably upright. McBride quietly instructed us to fall back in bounding pairs, rifles trained outward, and we moved as quickly as discipline allowed, hearts hammering against our ribs, eyes scanning every shift in the underbrush, certain that at any moment something would break from the tree-line and test the limits of our courage. But nothing attacked, nothing lunged, because whatever stalked us that night seemed less interested in killing us and more fascinated with how we reacted, as though we were not soldiers but specimens, and the forest around us a controlled environment for whatever intelligence lurked beyond our vision. By the time the base lights appeared through the gaps in the trees, the laughter faded, the voices dwindled, and the night became normal again. Not safe, not calm, but emptied of the presence that had toyed with us, leaving only the knowledge that something out there could mimic us perfectly, could speak with our voices, could summon us deeper into the woods with a call we were trained to obey, and that realization weighed heavier than any pack we carried. By the morning after the voice-mimicking incident, the entire platoon operated like a group of men who'd aged a decade overnight, each of us carrying an invisible weight that pressed into our shoulders and made even simple tasks feel heavier. Yet the Army machine leaves no room for fear, so training continued as scheduled. Though every man felt the shift, something had come back with us from the woods. Something unseen, yet undeniably present, lingering just beyond the edge of our vision. Strange. Reports began circulating almost immediately. Soldiers in different companies claimed they heard footsteps pacing outside their barracks at night, slow and deliberate, as though counting how many men slept inside. Others swore they saw a figure crouched atop the motor pool roof at dawn, its silhouette hunched and wrong, vanishing the moment anyone attempted to focus on it. Even the military police officers, men who openly laughed at ghost stories, started responding to 3 a.m. calls about someone. Knocking on windows, tapping lightly in the exact rhythm of one of the squad's inside jokes. A pattern only someone intimate with our group could have known. At first, the officers suspected a prankster, but when thermal cameras picked up a heat signature too large to be a man, yet too narrow to be a bear, patrolling soldiers started keeping their rifles unholstered, eyes sweeping the perimeter with growing unease. Meanwhile, inside the barracks, sleep became a battle in itself. Every time someone drifted into slumber, a noise would jolt them awake. A scraping against metal bunks, a low growl from beneath the flooring, or worse, a faint whisper of their own name slipping from the darkness above them, delivered in a voice they recognized, yet coming from a direction where no person stood. Tensions rose until fights nearly broke out over who heard what, but beneath the anger lay something deeper, a shared terror none of us wanted to voice aloud. Then came the night Private Hargrove nearly shot Collins when he saw a figure standing in the stairwell with Collins' exact height, posture, and uniform, only for the real Collins to walk out of the latrine at that exact moment, causing Hargrove to drop his rifle in shock while the impersonator melted into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint scent of wet soil and rot, as though something crawled out of the earth rather than walked upon it. Rumors spread that the creature, the same one from the glade, the same one that mimicked our voices, had slipped on a base and was learning us, studying our habits the way a hunter studies a herd, pushing boundaries with a terrifying confidence. McBride reported the incidents to the chain of command, but the officers dismissed the accounts as sleep deprivation, insisting that stress and adrenaline caused hallucinations. Yet their forced calm felt brittle, like men trying to convince themselves more than us. Especially after one lieutenant returned pale from solo patrol around the perimeter wall, refusing to explain why he fired 2 warning shots into the tree. The base chaplain, a quiet older man who rarely left his office, started wandering through the barracks at night, murmuring prayers under his breath. And though no one asked what prompted the change, the dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he too had heard something that unsettled his faith by the 4th night. The atmosphere on base had shifted entirely. Lights felt dimmer, hallways seemed longer shadows, pooled in strange places, and everyone sensed a presence moving among us with increasing boldness, as if testing how close it could come without being confronted. Then, shortly after midnight, we heard it again. The laughter, that same corrupt, layered sound from the woods, echoing through the motor pool like a voice bouncing between metal walls, taunting us, mocking our helplessness. And when we rushed outside with rifles ready, scanning every direction with jittery hands, the laughter stopped, abruptly replaced by the sound of something sprinting across the gravel with inhuman speed, too fast to track with the naked eye. The floodlights flickered, one after another, as though something massive passed beneath them, and when the lights stabilized, we saw fresh tracks in the gravel. Prints shaped almost like human footprints, but elongated, narrow, and ending in claw-like indentations. Each step pressed deep, as if the creature weighed far more than its slender frame suggested. McBride ordered us to fall back inside, lock doors, stay together, and though no soldier likes to admit fear, every man obeyed without hesitation, because the truth had finally become undeniable. Whatever followed us out of the woods was no longer content to watch from a distance. It had chosen us, marked us, and now walked freely among the structures and shadows of our own base, with the confidence of something that understood we had no idea how to fight it. The night everything finally broke began with a silence so unnatural it felt like a weight pressing against our ears, a suffocating stillness that stretched across the base like a sheet pulled tight. And even before the first sound reached us, every man in the barracks sensed that something was coming, something deliberate and hungry, something no longer content with prowling the edges of our world. We had been ordered to remain inside, doors locked, rifles loaded, lights dimmed, yet none of. Those precautions offered a shred of comfort as we sat on our bunks, staring at the narrow windows that overlooked the motor pool, half expecting a face not belonging to any human to appear at any moment. The first sign came as a metallic groan from somewhere above us. The high, strained bending of steel under considerable weight, and though the barracks roof was reinforced, the sound repeated, slow and rhythmic, like something crawling across it on all fours, testing the structural strength. Beneath its claws, each movement sending a tremor of cold dread down our spines. No one spoke, not even McBride, who usually dealt with fear like it was an opponent he'd memorized the weaknesses of, but tonight even he held his breath as dust sifted down from the ceiling tiles, gently, lazily drifting like snow from the vibrations above. Then, without warning, something scraped across the far window, a long, deliberate drag that left a streak on the glass, as though a single elongated finger, or claw, had traced its way across while peering inside. Private Collins, sitting closest to the window, jerked backward so violently he toppled off his bunk, scrambling away on the floor like a man expecting the glass to shatter inward at any second. And before McBride could reassure him, a second scrape. This one slower, deeper, cut across the pane, the sound so sharp it made several men clap hands over their ears. The lights flickered, then steadied, and then flickered again, as though the creature's presence alone interfered with the electrical system. And that was when the tapping began. Soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakably patterned. The same tapping rhythm we used inside the squad. One only we would recognize, our private signal, now performed from outside by something that was not part of our unit. A ripple of horror moved through us as the tapping repeated, louder, more insistent, as though the creature was mocking not just our fear, but our camaraderie. McBride, trembling with barely contained fury, signaled for total silence and pointed toward the hallway, where the faint shuffle of footsteps approached, slow and dragging, accompanied by the faint sound of breathing, raspy, broken, almost wet, like lungs that had forgotten how to function properly. The footsteps stopped at the door, and for a long moment nothing happened, until a voice, Colin's voice, spoke from the other side, saying, "Let me in," with the exact tone and cadence he used during inspections. Only the Real Collins sat behind us, shaking so hard his teeth chattered. The imitation repeated the demand, now impatient, its voice cracking like strained vocal cords stretching too far, and when McBride refused to answer, the voice deepened, shifting pitch rapidly like a broken radio, scanning frequencies, until it settled on a distorted version of McBride's own commands. "Open the door, Sergeant," it growled. The familiarity twisted into something predatory. Then the handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately, though it was locked, and the metal groaned under the pressure of something applying force far beyond human capability. Men raised their rifles, but for all our training, none of us knew what firing would accomplish against something that could mimic us, outrun us, and move in ways that violated the natural order. The handle stopped suddenly, and for a moment we believed the creature had left, until a thunderous impact shook the entire door, bending the steel inward as though struck by a battering ram, the frame splintering, dust raining down, and several men fell to the floor as the shock reverberated through the building. Another impact followed, then another, each more violent than the last. The warped panel now bulging inward with the shape of something pressing against it from the other side. Something too tall, too slender, its outline visible through the dented metal like a nightmare, trying to force its way into waking reality. Then, just as the door seemed ready to give way entirely, the impact stopped, replaced by a long, low exhale that seeped under the frame like a hot breath from a massive animal. And as we listened, frozen, the creature whispered, not in imitation this time, but in a voice that sounded ancient, layered, and incomprehensibly hateful, before the footsteps receded, slow and deliberate, leaving us trembling, clutching rifles that suddenly felt like toys, knowing that it had chosen not to break and only because it wanted something else, something worse, the fear it planted inside us. The following day, the base woke under a gray, oppressive sky, the kind that chills bone and spirit alike. And though no one spoke openly about the previous night's near breach, the truth clung to every soldier like a second uniform. Something had tested our defenses, learned our reactions, pressed its face against the thin fabric separating our world from whatever realm it crawled out of. Command tried masking the situation beneath official language, issuing orders for heightened readiness. But their forced calm was brittle as dry twigs, and every man who'd heard that creature whisper beneath our door knew these measures were pointless. Mere theater against a predator that traveled through darkness like it was water. We were assigned a perimeter watch, an attempt to reassure the base even though none of us felt remotely capable of facing what stalked the grounds. And as we moved along the chain-link fence with rifles raised, the forest beyond stood unervingly still, the treetops, motionless despite the wind that tugged at our uniforms, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Radio chatter remained minimal, mostly short status updates, until suddenly the feed crackled with an unfamiliar voice. Not from any soldier, not from any frequency we used, a whisper weaving in and out of static, speaking our names, one by one, the cadence identical to how we performed roll call in the mornings. McBride immediately ordered us to cut communication, but even after we shut down the radios, the voice continued faintly, vibrating through the air itself, drifting across the tree line like a low chant, its pitch sliding between human and something profoundly animal. The tension grew unbearable, and when Private Mercer spotted movement deeper in the woods, we all followed his line of sight to see a shape pacing parallel to the fence, matching our movement step for step, its gait too smooth, too fluid, as though its limbs were jointed in ways ours were not. Every time it passed between trees, its silhouette shifted, sometimes hunched, sometimes upright, sometimes elongated into proportions no body should possess. And though we never caught a clear glimpse, its presence radiated with such malign intelligence that each man felt certain it was evaluating us, weighing strengths and weaknesses, memorizing our patterns with predatory patience. Suddenly, without warning, the creature stopped dead, and the forest erupted with unnatural silence as even birds ceased. Their calls, a silence so thick it felt like air had solidified. Then the creature let out a sound. Not a howl, not a growl, but something in between, starting as a deep rumble before blooming into a shrill, layered screech that vibrated in our chests, rattling bones, triggering a primal panic that clawed up our throats. Several men stumbled backward, clutching their rifles with trembling hands, and though every instinct screamed to fire, training held us frozen, waiting for the order that never came. The creature then began to walk toward the fence, slow, deliberate, each step pressing deeply into the earth until it stopped just short of the boundary, its shadow taller than any man, stretched unnaturally across the ground. And though the fence separated us, each soldier felt as exposed as if standing naked before a storm. Without warning, the creature crouched low, as though preparing to leap, and McBride finally shouted for retreat, his voice cracking with urgency we'd never heard from him before. We broke formation and sprinted back toward the vehicle line, boots thudding against the gravel in frantic rhythm, our breaths ragged. Yet behind us the creature did not give chase. Instead, it paced the fence line with almost amused calm, watching as though we were participants in a ritual it had orchestrated. When we reached the motor pool, the base alarms blared to life. echoing across the compound in shrill waves. And soldiers poured into defensive positions, rifles aimed toward the treeline. For a moment, the forest remained still, the creature's silhouette barely visible in the shifting shadows, and then it simply vanished, melting into the undergrowth with a fluidity so unnatural it made several men curse under their breath. Command attempted to regain control, barking orders through bullhorns, but fear had shredded morale, and whispers spread that the creature chose not to attack because it didn't need to. Its hunt was not about bodies, but minds, and slowly, day by day, it was claiming our sanity, piece by trembling piece. Worst of all, as we regrouped and tried to compose ourselves, a new piece of information surfaced from a terrified MP. The creature had been seen earlier near the command building, not prowling, not observing, instead standing perfectly still, staring up at the second-floor office window of our battalion commander, as if studying the man who believed he could control the situation. And when the MP approached to confront it, the creature had slowly turned its head with an eerily human motion and spoken a single word in a hollow, unnatural voice. Soon, in the fading hours before dawn, as the desert winds shifted with the sound of distant thunder rolling across the mesas, Lieutenant Harris stood silently atop the ridge with the uneasy awareness that the events of the past nights had pushed every man in his unit far beyond the limits of war, forcing them to confront not only their enemy, but the very fabric of the world they thought they understood. And now, as the crimson glow of the horizon bled into the cold sky, he felt the weight of the final confrontation closing in like an approaching storm. For the Skinwalkers, those ancient, shifting shadows tied to the broken remnants of forbidden practices were no longer hiding in the periphery, and their whispering forms slithered through the half-light as if feeding on fear itself, reminding him of the warnings Chief Talcon had given, that the barrier between worlds had been torn open not by chance, but by imbalance, by the relentless conflict that humans waged upon one another and upon the land. And so Harris gathered his remaining men, eyes hollow, weapons trembling and hands raw from exhaustion, and led them down into the ravine where the final ritual site lay, a circle of stones etched with symbols older than any written history, symbols that even the Navajo elders feared to speak aloud. Yet Talcon stood resolute at its center, chanting in the old tongue with a voice that sounded like gravel dragged across fire, a voice carrying the sorrow of many generations who had guarded these secrets. And as the rhythmic chant grew, the air thickened, distorting like heat waves rising from asphalt, and the shadows around them convulsed, taking on grotesque silhouettes of wolves, coyotes, and half-formed human shapes, their eyes glowing with a cold hunger that no bullet could satisfy. Harris ordered his men to hold the perimeter, though he knew deep inside that rifles were little more than false comfort against forces that existed outside the boundaries of war. But still, the soldiers fired as the Skinwalkers lunged, their bodies dissolving and reforming as if carved from smoke, their shrieks echoing like the cries of forgotten spirits clawing at memories, and the cacophony of screams, gunshots, and growling winds fused into a chilling symphony that shook the ravine. One by one, men fell, not always from wounds, but from terror, collapsing under visions the creatures forced into their minds. Visions of home, of loss, of futures snatched away by something ancient and merciless. Yet amid the chaos, Talcon continued his chant unwavering, drawing the darkness toward the stone circle, binding it with ancestral power. But the ritual required balance and sacrifice. Realizing this truth as if it were whispered directly into his thoughts, Harris stepped forward, recalling the elders' earlier words. The land does not choose lightly, but when it does, it asks for the brave. With the Skinwalkers closing in, circling like predatory shadows hungry for the ritual's failure, Harris placed his hand on Talcon's shoulder and gave a single nod, a silent acceptance, and Talcon's expression, somber yet grateful, confirmed that the lieutenant had understood the role the land demanded. Harris stepped into the circle just as the world around him collapsed into swirling darkness, and he felt something cold and ancient coil around his spine, testing his resolve, probing his memories, searching for weakness, finding none. For Harris, despite all fears, held tightly to the belief that his men deserved a chance to return home, that the horrors they had witnessed should not define them. And in that final moment of defiance, he shouted, a raw, primal cry that cut through the void like a blade, and the shadows recoiled as Talcon's final chant rose to a thunderous crescendo. A blinding burst of white light erupted from the stones, engulfing both Harris and the skinwalkers, in a searing wave that scattered their forms like ash in a storm. And when it faded, the ravine fell silent except for the soft whisper of the wind. The sun rose fully then, spilling gentle gold across the desert as the surviving soldiers looked around in disbelief, finding no trace of Harris, but feeling, strangely, a sense of calm they had not known for many nights. Talcon, now exhausted and trembling, told them quietly that Harris had crossed into the spirit world as the guardian who sealed the breach, ensuring that the darkness would not return. And though grief weighed heavily on every man, they left the ravine with a renewed reverence for the unseen forces of the land. Years later, some would swear that during quiet desert nights, they heard a familiar voice carried by the wind, steady and commanding, as though Lieutenant Harris still watched over the mesas where he made his final stand.